In 1964, a loud-mouthed 22-year-old walked into a Miami boxing ring as a massive underdog. Nobody believed he could win. Bookmakers gave him almost no chance. 6 rounds later, he stood over the most feared heavyweight on the planet, screaming at the world to eat their words. That night, a legend was born. But the story of how he got there, and everything he sacrificed after, is far bigger than boxing, bigger than any single fight or title. This is the story of a boy from a segregated street in Kentucky who refused to let the world define who he could become. This is the story of Muhammad Ali. Long before the world knew him as Muhammad Ali, he was Cassius Marcellus Clay, Jr., born January 17, 1942, in Louisville, Kentucky. He was the first son of Cassius Clay Sr., a sign and mural painter, and Odessa Clay, a domestic worker who cleaned houses for wealthier white families across town. They raised their 2 boys in a modest pink shotgun house on Grand Avenue, in a city where the color line was drawn sharply through everyday life. Separate schools, separate restaurants, separate water fountains. Even as a child, Cassius had a restless, almost electric energy. Teachers described him as talkative, quick-witted, and constantly moving, more interested in being seen and heard than sitting still behind a desk. His mother would later say he was born knowing he was going to be somebody. He just didn't yet know how. The story that changed everything happened almost by accident. At 12 years old, Cassius rode his brand new red Schwinn bicycle downtown with a friend to an event, and when they came out, the bike was gone. Furious and in tears, he stormed around looking for a police officer, telling anyone who'd listen that he wanted to fight whoever took it. He eventually found Officer Joe Martin, who happened to run a boxing program for local kids at a nearby recreation center. Martin gave him a piece of advice that would alter the course of boxing history. If you want to fight somebody, you better learn how to fight first. Cassius showed up the very next week. He wasn't a natural at first. Awkward, too upright, dropping his hands the way self-taught street fighters do. But he had something coaches couldn't teach: obsessive discipline. He ran through the dark streets of Louisville before sunrise, shadow boxing against his own reflection in shop windows, studying old fight reels, sparring anyone who'd step into the ring with him, regardless of size. Within just a few years, the awkward beginner had transformed into one of the most promising amateur boxers in the country, racking up Golden Gloves titles across Kentucky and beyond. By his teenage years, he was already telling reporters, coaches, and total strangers that he was going to be the greatest boxer who ever lived. Most people laughed at the boast. He didn't care. He needed the world to watch him become it, and he was willing to outwork anyone alive to make sure they did. By 1960, 18-year-old Cassius Clay had already compiled an amateur record most professionals would envy: 100 wins against just a handful of losses. He earned his spot on the U.S. Olympic boxing team and traveled to Rome as a virtual unknown outside amateur boxing circles, but with the same larger-than-life confidence that would soon define him globally. He fought his way through the light heavyweight bracket with blinding hand speed and unconventional footwork that baffled opponents trained to expect a traditional, flat-footed heavyweight style. He talked to reporters constantly, joked with other athletes in the Olympic Village, and treated the entire games like a stage built specifically for him. In the final, he defeated Poland's experienced southpaw Zbigniew Pietrkowski to win Olympic gold. He returned home a national hero, an 18-year-old with a gold medal around his neck, his face suddenly recognizable across the country. For a brief moment, it must have felt like every door in America had swung open for him. It hadn't. Segregation didn't pause for Olympic champions. Restaurants in his own hometown still refused to serve him. The gold medal that made him famous overseas meant nothing to the laws that still governed where he could eat, sleep, or sit on a bus back home in Kentucky. It was a brutal, clarifying lesson for the young champion. Fame and even excellence could not purchase equality in the world he actually lived in. That contradiction would shape nearly everything that came next in his life. Just weeks after returning from Rome, Clay made his professional debut in October 1960, a 6-round decision win over police officer-turned-boxer Tony Hunziker in his hometown of Louisville. It was a modest, unglamorous start compared to what was coming, but it marked the first step of what would become one of the most closely followed professional careers in sports history. Over the next 3 years, he moved to Miami to train under the legendary Angelo Dundee, steadily climbing the heavyweight rankings while building a reputation as much for his mouth as his fists. Turning professional under the guidance of a group of Louisville businessmen who financed his early career, Clay's record grew undefeated fight after fight. His style baffled seasoned boxing writers who expected a heavyweight to plant his feet and trade heavy blows toe-to-toe. Instead, he floated, hands held low, head moving just out of range, footwork almost dancer-like for a man his size, before snapping out a jab faster than anyone had seen from a fighter that large. Old-school trainers called it reckless. It kept working anyway. But it was outside the ring where his life changed most permanently. In the early 1960s, Clay grew close to the Nation of Islam, drawn to its message of black pride, self-respect, and self-determination during an era when black Americans were still fighting for basic civil rights across the country. He began attending meetings quietly, wary of how the association might affect his career, and formed a close friendship with Minister Malcolm X, who became something of a mentor during this period. In February 1964, mere days after stunning the world by defeating heavyweight champion Sonny Liston, Clay publicly confirmed his conversion to Islam and announced a new name, Muhammad Ali. Many in the press refused to use it, continuing to call him Cassius Clay for years, out of stubbornness or spite. Some openly mocked the decision. Ali stood firm regardless. He explained in interview after interview that Cassius Clay had been his family's slave name, inherited from a white slaveholder generations before he was born, and that Muhammad Ali was the name of a free man who answered to no one. It wasn't simply a name change, it was a declaration. From that moment forward, the man in the ring wasn't only fighting other boxers for a championship belt. He was fighting for the basic right to define his own identity, on his own terms, in front of an entire country that wasn't always ready to let him. February 25th, 1964. Miami Beach. Sonny Liston was widely regarded as unbeatable, a granite-fisted ex-convict champion who had destroyed every man put in front of him, most in a single round. Bookmakers listed Clay as a 7-to-1 underdog. Ringside doctors reportedly worried the young challenger might genuinely get hurt, or worse. Clay had other plans, and he began executing them long before the opening bell. In the weeks leading up to the fight, he taunted Liston relentlessly at press conferences, calling him the Big Ugly Bear and promising he would float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. At the official weigh-in, he appeared almost unhinged with theatrical rage, screaming that he was ready, that Liston was going down, a performance so intense that some reporters genuinely believed he'd lost his composure. It was calculated psychological warfare, designed to unsettle a champion who built his entire reputation on intimidating opponents into defeat before the first punch was ever thrown. When the opening bell finally rang, Clay did exactly what he'd promised. He moved constantly, refusing to plant his feet and trade with a bigger, far harder-hitting man, instead circling, jabbing, and frustrating Liston round after round with pure speed. There was a scare in round 5 when something, possibly liniment from Liston's gloves, burned Clay's eye so badly he could barely see, and he nearly quit on his stool. His trainer, Angelo Dundee, refused to let him, shoving him back out for the round and telling him to simply run until his vision cleared. By the 6th round, Liston, exhausted, frustrated, and thoroughly outclassed, sat on his stool and refused to answer the bell for round 7, citing a shoulder injury. At just 22 years old, Cassius Clay was heavyweight champion of the world. He leapt to the ropes, screaming down at the ringside reporters who had doubted him all week. "I am the greatest. I shook up the world." With the title won, Ali became something the sport had never quite seen before, a heavyweight champion who was equal parts athlete and entertainer. He composed short, mocking poems predicting exactly which round he'd knock out his next opponent, then frequently delivered on the prediction. Reporters nicknamed him the Louisville Lip for his non-stop trash talk, but audiences couldn't look away. His fights sold out arenas not just because people wanted to see boxing, but because they wanted to see him. He defended his title repeatedly through 1964, 1965, and 1966, including a controversial rematch against Sonny Liston that ended in the first round on a punch some ringside observers barely saw connect, fueling conspiracy theories for years afterward. He demolished former champion Floyd Patterson in a fight laced with genuine animosity, after Patterson publicly refused to call him by his new name. Fight after fight, win after win, Ali wasn't just defending a championship belt, he was building a persona, a brand, and a platform larger than boxing had ever produced before. His fights during this stretch became genuine media events, drawing celebrities, musicians, and world leaders to ringside, many of them curious, as much about the man's personality as his boxing skill. He appeared on television talk shows reciting poetry, sparred playfully with reporters, and became one of the most photographed men on the planet, a level of global celebrity that no athlete, let alone a boxer, had previously achieved. Behind the showmanship, though, his political and religious convictions were deepening. He spoke more openly about race, faith, and injustice in interviews, increasingly unwilling to separate the champion from the man. It made him beloved by many and deeply resented by others, a tension that was about to collide head-on with the biggest political conflict of the decade. By 1966, the United States was deeply entangled in the Vietnam War, and Ali, now heavyweight champion, was reclassified and drafted into military service. He refused to go. As a devout Muslim and self-declared conscientious objector, he explained his refusal in words that would echo for decades afterward, questioning why he should travel 10,000 miles to fight a war against people who had never done him any harm. While Black Americans back home were still being denied basic rights and dignity, it was one of the most controversial public stances of the decade. A heavyweight champion, at the height of his fame, publicly defying his own government during wartime. The backlash was swift and severe. Ali was arrested, convicted of draft evasion, and immediately stripped of his heavyweight title by boxing commissions across the country, who also revoked his license to box in state after state. At the absolute physical peak of his career, 25 years old, unbeaten, arguably the fastest heavyweight the sport had ever produced, Muhammad Ali was banned from boxing entirely, facing a potential prison sentence. He didn't fight professionally again for 3.5 years, the heart of what should have been his athletic prime, gone. Where a lesser man might have quietly disappeared, Ali turned instead to his voice. He toured college campuses across the country, debating students, defending his position, slowly becoming an unlikely unifying symbol for both the anti-war movement and the broader civil rights struggle happening simultaneously. He lost millions of dollars in potential earnings during those years. He lost physical prime that no amount of training could ever fully recover once it was gone. In 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court finally overturned his conviction in a unanimous decision, clearing the way for his return. But by his own account, he never once regretted the stand he took, even knowing everything it cost him. In late 1970, Ali's boxing license was finally reinstated. He was no longer the lightning-fast 22-year-old who'd shocked Sonny Liston. 3.5 years away from the ring had visibly slowed his legs, even if his spirit remained untouched. His first comeback fights were grinding wars of attrition rather than the dazzling speed exhibitions of his youth, culminating in a brutal March 1971 showdown with the undefeated Joe Frazier, billed simply as the fight of the century. Ali lost a hard-fought 15-round decision, his first professional defeat, and a deeply personal one, given the bitter rivalry that had grown between the two men, a rivalry that involved real, lasting animosity outside the ring as much as inside it. But Ali's story was never really about avoiding adversity. It was about how relentlessly he responded to it. In October 1974, he traveled to Kinshasa, Zaire, to challenge heavyweight champion George Foreman in a bout that promoters dubbed the Rumble in the Jungle. Foreman was younger, significantly stronger, and had brutally knocked out both men who'd previously beaten Ali. Most experts, including members of Ali's own camp, feared for his safety going in. What happened next became one of the most legendary strategic performances in sports history. Ali abandoned his usual dancing style entirely and instead leaned back against the ropes, absorbing Foreman's heaviest punches round after round in a tactic later nicknamed the rope-a-dope, letting the younger champion punch himself into exhaustion. The watching world, gathered around televisions at 4 a.m. local time, was terrified Ali was simply being beaten to pieces in real time. He wasn't. He was waiting. In the 8th round, with Foreman's arms finally heavy and his once thunderous punches slowing to a crawl, Ali exploded off the ropes with a lightning combination that dropped the previously undefeated champion to the canvas for the count. The Rumble in the Jungle wasn't just a victory. It made Muhammad Ali heavyweight champion of the world for the second time, at 32 years old, in what many still consider the single greatest tactical performance boxing has ever witnessed. The rivalry with Joe Frazier reached its brutal conclusion in October 1975, in a bout fittingly named the Thrilla in Manila, fought in punishing tropical heat that pushed both men to their absolute physical limits. It became arguably the most savage heavyweight fight in history, both men trading vicious punishment for 14 full rounds before Frazier's trainer finally stopped the fight, unable to watch his fighter absorb any more damage. Ali won, but he later admitted it felt the closest thing to dying he'd ever experienced, a fight that, in his own words, aged him more than any other single night of his career. Time catches every fighter eventually, and Ali was no exception. He continued fighting into his late 30s, taking increasingly hard punishment in bouts he likely should have walked away from years earlier, before finally retiring in 1981 at age 39. By the early 1980s, the once lightning reflexes that had defined his entire career had visibly slowed, his speech beginning to noticeably thicken between rounds and interviews alike. In 1984, 3 years after his final fight, Ali was diagnosed with Parkinson's syndrome, a condition many neurologists believe was accelerated by the tens of thousands of punches he absorbed across a 2-decade professional career. the man who had once talked faster and louder than anyone else in sports, slowly lost the ability to speak clearly at all, his hands beginning to visibly tremble in public. But even as his body betrayed him, his presence in the world never diminished. In 1996, a visibly trembling 54-year-old Ali lit the Olympic cauldron in Atlanta in one of the most emotional moments in Olympic history, his hand shaking uncontrollably as he held the torch aloft, the entire stadium rising to its feet in a standing ovation that lasted for several unbroken minutes. It remains, to this day, one of the most replayed moments in the history of the Games. In his later years, Ali largely stepped back from public life, though he continued humanitarian work around the world, delivering food and medical aid to struggling nations, advocating tirelessly for Parkinson's research funding, and quietly meeting with world leaders to promote peace and understanding, even as his own voice grew fainter with each passing year. He traveled to Iraq in 1990 to help negotiate the release of American hostages, and repeatedly used what remained of his global fame to support causes that had nothing to do with boxing at all. In 2005, President George W. Bush awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, America's highest civilian honor, recognizing a lifetime that had long since outgrown the boxing ring. Muhammad Ali passed away on June 3, 2016, at the age of 74, mourned by presidents, athletes, and millions of ordinary people around the world whose lives he had touched without ever meeting them personally. His funeral procession drew enormous crowds lining the streets of Louisville for miles, a city that had once refused to serve him in its restaurants, now grinding to a halt to honor him. He was remembered not simply as a boxer, but as one of the most consequential cultural and political figures of the entire 20th century. He sacrificed his physical prime for his principles, walking away from millions of dollars and years of his athletic peak rather than compromise what he believed. He turned a boxing ring into a global stage for something far bigger than sport. Race, religion, war, and the basic right to self-determination. And he proved again and again, across decades of both triumph and hardship, that true greatness isn't only measured in championship belts. It's measured in the price a person is willing to pay to stand by what they believe, especially when standing firm costs them everything they've built. He said it himself, better than anyone else ever could. Service to others is the rent we pay for our room here on earth. This has been the story of Muhammad Ali, the boy from a segregated street in Louisville who grew into the man who shook the entire world and never once apologized for it. Decades later, his daughter, Laila Ali, would go on to become a champion boxer herself, carrying forward a legacy that had, by then, long transcended the sport that made it famous. Museums, documentaries, and entire generations of athletes across every discipline continued to cite him as the blueprint for using platform and fame in service of something larger than personal glory.